we were talking about how reactionary the Articles of Confederation really were towards what they experienced with the king and why they declared independence. And so it wasn't a document that really thought through how government could really function. So much of it was what all the things we didn't like about the king, we're going to ensure it can't happen again. But with that reaction and with that mindset in setting up a federal government, does it make a federal government functional? And it didn't. Here's the problem. No federal government, no major government. That's why the king had all those acts, the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act, the Townshend Acts, because every government needs money to function. Well, under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government could not tax the states. So where was the federal government going to get the money to run a post office, to have an army, things like that? The states didn't have to follow the laws or the treaties. If they didn't agree with it, they just said, okay, fine, you do your thing, federal government, but we're not going to abide by it. Each state had their own laws, and so you didn't know if you wanted to do business and trade from state to state. Let's say you had a textile mill in New England, and you wanted to get your cotton from the southern states. There were all these laws that made it very confusing. You know, South Carolina had their own laws. You have your own laws in Massachusetts about trade and tax and things like that. And so how do you conduct business, and what does that do to the economy? There was no executive branch, no leader, which was essential, and there was no national court system. If one state had a grievance or a problem with another state, there was no place for them to go to remedy it, to rectify it, to have, in a sense, their say in court. And any amendment, any change to the government, it had to be a unanimous vote. So everybody had to agree, which is pretty difficult to do. Congress asked the states, so looking at all this, and they fought the war ended, and so the country was trying to function a few years after the war finally ended, and they realized this isn't working. So they sent Congress, the one branch of government under the Articles, asked all the states to send delegates to a convention, and their task was, we need to relook at our government, and we need to make changes to make it functional. So there were 55 delegates from the 12 states. The states sent multiple delegates. George Washington was the president of the convention, and on the third day, Virginia introduced a plan for the government. So you have to understand that in this room, at this convention, the different states had lots of different interests and lots of different things they wanted to make sure was going to be in that new government. And so on the third, they're talking, and these ideas are getting thrown around, and they're arguing, and they're debating them in the Congress. And on the third day, Virginia introduces a plan for the government. And instead of having one branch, a legislative branch, they said, we're going to have 3 branches. And in their plan, there was an executive branch and a judicial. The executive branch would meet the need of there would be a leader. There would be somebody in charge. And then the judicial branch was a branch where the courts were, where you could, if you had grievances, if there was wrongs done, especially between the states, there was a place to go have your grievances addressed. But the Virginia plan caused great controversy. Understand that in this convention, it wasn't a polite, nice discussion. People were very emotional. They felt very strong about what they sacrificed for this new country, their vision for this country. They met in Philadelphia. They had guards around the building. They didn't want the discussions to be let out. They wanted, so it was pretty heated and very intense. This is what the Virginia plan did. The Virginia plan said, for the legislative branch, for the people that you vote to represent you, that the more population a state had, and Virginia was one of the states with a much higher population, the more representatives they would have in the government. The large states loved it, but the smaller states said, hey, we'll never have an equal voice. We'll never have an equal say just because we don't have a large population. So the smaller states were like, no way, no way, no way, no way. And then New Jersey, which is a smaller state, proposed that the one house, the legislative branch, would have a Congress, that one body, but that one body would be divided into two groups. And one of the controversies here was New Jersey said, oh no, each state will have one vote. And so you have a real conflict between the larger states and the small. And so, I'm sorry I said New Jersey before, but Connecticut heard these two arguments, and they came up with this compromise. One house would have equal representation. That house would be called the Senate. One house that makes up Congress would be based on population. So in one place, every state is at an equal balance. Another place, the states with more population, with more people, those people have the right to have a say in their government, so they get more representatives. This compromise, after all this arguing, was called that, the Great Compromise. And it was the way it satisfied both sides. And this was written in the new document. The other problem they had was, what are we going to do with slaves? When you're talking about population, you're talking about representation, what do we do with the South, who have all these slaves? Do we count them? Well, of course, the reaction in the North is no, because then the South would have more representatives in the government, in Congress, and they would have more power and more say. And so that was a real problem for the North. Of course, the South wanted all the slaves to be counted, and they really got to the point of suggesting either we count all these slaves, or, you know, we just broke away a few years ago from a king, we'll break away from you and set up our own country. So in order to keep the Union together, both sides, the North and the South, came up with what they call the 3/5 compromise. So what they said was each slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person, not a whole person, just 3/5. And what that would come out to is, let's say there was 50 slaves. They would get 30 of them would be counted. 3 of the 5 would be counted. And that's how it worked out. So every 5 slaves, 3 would be counted. So that took care of how slaves at some level would be represented in this new government. But what do we do with slavery? You know, when we talk about in the Declaration, and we're fighting for our rights and we're fighting for freedoms, how do we balance that with, oh, but we have slavery? Some of the great men, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration, he had a whole bunch of slaves. And so Washington had slaves. How do you balance this? The idea of the ideals we fought for and the reality we live with. So there was a real problem about the slave trade. And so do we mention this in the Constitution? Is slavery going to be an issue? And they really decided to just leave it with the 3/5 compromise because they were, they'd just gone through a revolution. They just fought this war. They're trying to just make it, get something established, and to get this country going. So they decided we're not going to really deal with the idea of do we allow the slave trade in our country for a good 20 years. We will allow it, and then after that it's going to be abolished. What that means is you could have slavery in the country. You could trade slaves from state to state. But by 1808, you could not bring any more slaves in from other parts of the world. At that point, it became illegal. We will look at the whole idea. Not only did they have to deal with slavery and the different sections of this new country and their interests, and the interests of the states with different populations, but how are they gonna divide up this new land that they won? And we will look at that in the next.